Hi, everybody. I know it feels like we just finished, but it's 2 o'clock, and I want to get started introducing our next speaker. So I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce my department chair, Dr. Don Yealy, who is here all the way from Pittsburgh, just like me. But he is here to talk about like the boots on the ground kind of finance stuff that I really feel that at UPMC we've been undergoing. And so I think that he's going to do an excellent job and answer all your questions. So thank you, Don, for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate the invite, Julie, and I'm glad that you made the time today to share a little bit. I'll probably get off the podium here in a few seconds and wander around. But first, you know, this has to be a little interactive, and Julie and Brian can't answer. What's wrong with that picture? There's a glaring error in this picture. Anybody here grow up in Western Pennsylvania? Probably not. That's a picture of downtown Pittsburgh. Mark, you're not allowed to answer either because you spent time at Pittsburgh. So this is the U.S. Steel building. That's where U.S. Steel Corporation was and still is housed. For a long time, it was only U.S. Steel. Now that has gone through, politely say, contractures, it occupies maybe a third of that building, if even that. So our organization took over that building, and right now that has big, gaudy UPMC letters all over it that everybody in the city hates. And I chose to show you what the downtown looks like without the gaudiness. So now you know. What I'd like to do is go through departmental finances, some of the realities and strategizing for success. And one of the things I thought about, first off, I wondered why did Julie ask me to do this? And I think the reason is, and I've not discussed this with her, is that I do a version of this talk for our graduating residents and fellows each year, right around this time of the year. We have a session to help transition into a faculty job, whether they're going into a community or an academic program. And one of them is, you know, how does the department run and what are the dollars? And so I suspect that because of some of the feedback with that, it would be a good idea here. What I promise you is I am not going to show a singular balance sheet or income statement. I'm not going to show you anybody's specific finances because, in fact, as you'll see later on, you know, one set of finances or one set of finances. I think what's probably far more important, the reason you're here is that you have some thoughts about a leadership career. And it's probably much more important to have learned some of the basic principles about how department finances work, not specifics of any one particular area. I'd rather reframe your general thinking about it than show you very specific numbers. Now, I had to learn this on the job. I was a biology major undergraduate, and then I went to medical school, and that's that. And I was a vice chair for 16 years before I became chairman. So I had to learn a lot about how this works from others, from the business people around me, and from making mistakes. Good judgment comes from bad judgment, and that's how you get to a more senior position. Aside from being the department chair at both the medical school and for the health system, I oversee right now 24 emergency departments, 9 urgent care centers, about 1,000,001 visits, acute care visits a year. By this time next year, it'll be 32 emergency departments. Actually, I'll have the biggest staffing group in Pennsylvania. I never thought I'd actually be a big staffing group. I thought I signed up for an academic job, and somehow the job shifted. But I'm also, in the UPMC structure, probably the third physician in command as senior medical director, in addition to the vice president for urgent and emergent care services. So I get to see finances not only from the emergency medicine side and from our department and the struggles as a chairman, but also then on all the compensation and budgeting committees for 22 other departments and across one of the largest healthcare systems in the country. Actually, the largest academic healthcare system in the country is UPMC. So I want to share some of that perspective, and it may actually be at variance with some of the stuff you've been hearing through the rest of the day. This is the rest of the usual disclosure slide, nothing else there to talk about. Like any good teaching session, I should tell you what we're going to talk about. And can anyone tell that I did a little bit of educational training? Did I use the buzzwords like you're supposed to? Name and describe, and ask you to do very specific amounts of each. So I actually can be trained to do all these things. Whether you get the exact numbers or not, I don't think it's terribly important. But my goal here is at the end of it, if you think this is incredibly simple and that you knew it already, I've actually achieved what I wanted. It's easy to make anything sound complicated, whether it's the Krebs cycle or department finances. It's actually hard to make it sound more simple, and I'd hopefully get you to that conceptual framework. Anybody have any idea what this is? You were with me, so I know you know. This is me, yeah, and it's Ebola. And why is this slide up today? This was my, I'm donning, right? I'm not doffing in this? You're donning. I'm donning in this particular part of it. I ended up being our chief Ebola officer. Why the hell would an emergency physician be the chief Ebola officer in southwestern Pennsylvania? Why did someone ask me to do it? Because we get stuff done, period. You work across, everybody here works across all different types of disciplines all day long. It's the reason why you're going to be a chairman, you're going to be a CMO, you're going to be a COO. Kate left, she's going to run New York Presbyterian. You and I negotiate every day, all day long. That's actually the skill you learned in residency. No one ever actually told you that. It's not about thoracotomies and cardiac arrest. You're not intimidated by surgeons. Internists don't make you feel intellectually inferior. And you're used to getting people to resolution. So that was my job here, is how are we going to get this pandemic that never came. Why do I have this slide up today? It popped its head back up, right? Didn't we hear there were 30 more cases somewhere in Northern Africa? So I'm expecting another round of this kind of stuff to go on. This is how I felt at the end of this crap, because it was ungodly amounts. We had hepatitis coming in every day and maybe TB, and nobody was actually getting in a snit about that. But Ebola, that might happen to one of us, we were talking about multiple times. I did 3 TV interviews about it and said, you know, we'll have, just in our area next month, we'll probably have 20 people die of influenza, and there's not going to be a TV interview about that. And nobody's going to cover their mouth. So where do departments get money? Number one. The important thing to remember, and I don't care where you're at, I work at a top 5 medical school in NIH funding, top 10 in the U.S. News and World Report. What drives your finances is the clinical care. What drives your success as a chair will be the clinical operations. I actually heard on the previous panel people say, you know, some places want a more academic chair or a more clinical. Let me promise you, everybody wants someone and demands someone who will make the trains run on time and run well. And some others may want the academic part too. Nobody doesn't care, I hate the double negative, about the clinical side. No one doesn't care about that because they can't. 5 or 10 years ago, maybe you could have had that luxury. You can't anymore. Academic medical centers, and that's what we're disproportionately talking about, although this talk would go well anywhere else, are under duress. We're too expensive. We're too slow to adapt. Nobody wants to pay for it anymore. The only people who want there to be more spending on healthcare are sitting in this room or married to somebody sitting in this room. Everybody else wants it to be cheaper, faster, the way they want it. Our healthcare in general is being commoditized. And you and I are going to have to learn to live with that. People want it in the platform that they want as cheaply as possible, and they'll judge the quality. They're not interested in whether you think it's quality or not. They're interested in whether they think it is, and think about that. It's not really what to do it. So what drives your bottom line? Invariably, the clinical care. And that may be focused in the emergency department. It may be in other areas. We've branched off into not only urgent care, we provide the online teleplatform. Emergency physicians are fabulous at this. You actually know when you walk in the room and 3 questions, whether most people are sick or not sick. Why couldn't you do that on teleplatform? You're way better equipped to do that, or at least oversee it being done, even better, than almost anybody else. And that's an efficient model that generates clinical revenues at a certain type. You can't treat everything that way. It's very good for the itises above the belly button and below the nose. It works really well for that stuff. So clinical care, how do we get money? You get money from direct payments. In other words, you billed or tried to bill for somebody that you saw. Or you get it indirectly where someone gave you a bucket of money to do the same basic thing. Who here is in a county hospital kind of setting? So you probably get a large chunk because someone recognizes you're seeing people in need who you can drop all the bills you want, nothing's coming with it. One of the advantages in that system is that all the other accoutrements about billing you don't have to worry about, right? No one really cares if there's no bill about whether or not there was attending presence and all those fabricated notes that make it look like you saw them. This isn't being recorded, right? Okay. Julie's heard this riff. One of my. We just tweeted what you said. Okay. It happens to be the truth, but so you get paid for seeing people. It's actually one of the problems with the current healthcare system, and we're not immune to it. We get paid for making widgets, more and more widgets. Our widgets are seeing people and doing things to them. Okay, we all think we're doing the right things, but the truth of the matter is that's what we get paid for. How do they judge your work? What you said about what happened and how much of everything that you did. That's how you get to higher acuities, is you think about more things or order more tests. So it's very volume and acuity driven, and so one of the best ways is to actually find a way to see more patients, either at your site or take over more sites. My system is acquiring them left and right. I just told you I used to run one emergency department at an academic center when I was vice chair. That's all. It was 18, 19 faculty members, and I think I have 300 now because there's that many other places. So you can acquire, you can have same store growth, or you can acquire more broadly and get more and more market share. I think in all of your jobs this is going to be happening. I think your systems will either carve out more market share so that they can survive in this commoditization of healthcare, try to be a little bit more competitive, or they'll probably go under and be acquired by somebody else. Academic medical centers are going to fail. I don't know which ones they're going to be. They're going to fail. They're slow, expensive, they don't adapt very well. That's going to happen. No matter what it is, and I don't care where you're at, your clinical revenues coming in, at least 70% are coming from clinical care in the emergency department, period. Even if you're in a top 5 NIH funding and a wonderful place, you are still generating at least 70%. Brian, when you ran Brown, am I off? I'll bet it was closer to 85 is a more common number. It's at least 70%, and most times it's more like 80, 85. Mark, sound about right to you? I mean, and you're both at well steeped in tradition places. So we try to use physicians as much as possible, APPs, to try to get the right kind of provider for the right type of patient, to generate more and more of this activity. We do it through documentation. Our residents learn about this. They mislearn about this. We've created an entire culture of fabrication that lets us, how many people have had the 15-point system review as negative? It was completely. What does that mean? Aside from I want to get paid more. I get that part. That part wasn't lost on me at all. So we've created all this around here, and then there's coding, billing, and collecting, all the business side, all the back office stuff that you actually have to do if you want to get paid. It's complicated, it's a hassle, it costs money to get this to come back in. What are the threats? So we already talked about healthcare is becoming commoditized, which means people will compete on price and availability. Think of it the same way people, when airlines decide routes and pricing, what they found out again and again is nobody wants to pay a little bit more for a slightly nicer seat. It's almost always what is the most convenient, cheapest seat, period, end of sentence. We are going to be exposed to that. It's just starting to happen right now. Biggest change since probably the 1920s with the Flexner report. And academic medical centers are going to be exposed to it. People want it when they want it and at the price they want it. We're not very good at that. I think we can become good at it, but it's going to be a big change. IDFSs is an integrated delivery and finance system. That's where your healthcare system becomes both the insurer and the provider. Instead of one person getting the premium, taking a little taste on the way by, someone giving a little bit off to somebody else who has to have a taste on the way by, and it reminds you of Fanucci and The Godfather. Sooner or later, there's not enough water to wet everybody's beak, and someone goes without. Let me promise you, if you're not in an integrated system, yours is going to be the beak that gets the least amount of water. So one of the models is to try to develop your own, where you actually take control. It's kind of the new wave version of some of the risk sharing that was theorized about in the 80s. So at UPMC, we have our own insurance product. It's about, in Western Pennsylvania, about 40% of the market. That's a big chunk. It's actually bigger than the Blue Cross provider now. So all of a sudden, when my organization is both the payer and the provider, some of the things that we do don't make a lot of sense, like running up the bill and making sure that I scan everybody who has a kidney stone every time they have it. because maybe I'll find an abscess 1 out of 1,000 times, something like that. That just becomes a meaningless spend. When it was some other nameless insurer, I was making more widgets. I was making more for us and telling myself I was doing a good job at the same time too, right? Because I was looking hard for everything. So the IDFS model is likely coming to you in some way or form, whether your system becomes an insurer or tries to partner up with one. You should expect this. That'll begin to change a lot of the finance thing here. Shared savings is kind of a halfway point between that. That's where your traditional insurer still exists, but they say to you, if you cut something out, I'll share part of the money that we save. The challenge with that is the part that they're sharing with you is usually pretty tiny, and your loss, you may lose more in the widget making than you get back on the shared savings side, which means sooner or later either somebody gets paid less or somebody gets let go. At some point you just don't have enough, there are not enough dollars to continue either the same or upward growth. Quality payments is another mechanism where they identify something beyond volume and this is usually an insurer, that they would like from you. I get asked when it's not our own insurance product of, we would like to see, the last ask I got was, unenhanced lumbar CT scan rate drop at a few institutions. Identified some of the outlying ones and said you have that anomalous rates of just scanning lower backs. I have no earthly idea why you would do outside of trauma an unenhanced lumbar CT. Doesn't answer any of the questions that I'm usually thinking about, but could we work on that? As you can imagine, that's an interesting opportunity in quality. It's not going to bring in buckets of money. It'll bring in a little bit of that. So this is where all of your money comes from, whether you're at the Massachusetts General, the University of Pittsburgh, or you're working at the community hospital a half hour from our place. This is where it comes from. In the more community setting, this becomes 90%, maybe even 100%. If you're in a really affluent area, it becomes 110%. You make so much off of this that you can actually return money to the organization. That's still a pretty rare event, no matter what anybody tells you. So how do you grow this clinical revenue? You know, in the old model is you made more widgets. You found a way to do something. You either did more to each individual patient and documented it, hopefully, or you saw more patients, either at your same store or you grew out and you got more. That's how we grew the pie. You either took more market share or squeezed everything out of the market that you had available to you. The other way is to negotiate your rates. So that instead of getting X dollars for the widget, I get X plus whatever for the widget. The challenge in that last model is that I'll bet around the room here, almost no one in their shop has control over what rates are negotiated. I don't have it at ours. Ours are all done centrally. The organization, when it's negotiating with itself, by the way, who do you think is my worst payer? My own insurance company, because it's money laundering at that point. We're paying ourselves. You know, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's an accounting trick at that point. But with the rest of the insurers, since we don't insure 100% of the people in the area, they sent a central price for all of the practices and all of the hospitals and outpatient facilities. And I trust that they negotiate the biggest slice of the pie for the entire group. But the dirty little secret about this is they negotiate on behalf of both the hospital and us, and physicians invariably get 1/3 to 1/4 of what's billed on the technical side. And you have nothing to say. So one of the common things you'll say is, you know, you should eat what you kill. And mine is, well, it's not what I get to kill, it's what you allowed me to actually hunt for. I'm not even allowed to go out into the real jungle and see how well I can do. I'm only allowed to, you know, shoot at certain animals, or I'm playing blackjack, but there are no face cards in my deck. Can I win a hand or two? I probably can win once in a while, but I can't win consistently. You're going to ask me something. Not in the beginning, no.
Okay, so essentially they're not acting differently, even though there are some underlying financial incentives for them to act differently.
Yeah, so that brings up an interesting, it's both a performance, financial performance, moral, and care question. We've chosen the idea that if we're going to do things that are just the right thing to do inside of our model, we do it for everybody. I think, you know, what's right is right, and you have to do things that way. I think if you altered care systematically solely based on whether we insured you versus you were insured at all, you get into a whole other set of problems. So we actually don't make that distinction up front. So that your next question would be, does that mean you're taking a haircut on a few people? If you do the quote right thing or less of something, does that mean you're making less widgets? Yeah, it actually does. In this transition period is where this all gets really bumpy, you know. And eventually, in 5 or 10 years, I think most of the market will be this way, and this conversation will seem antiquated and cute. But it won't. Right now, you're right in the middle of it. We're still largely on a volume basis. There still is a lot of fee-for-service. I'll bet in certain areas of the country, people around here are places that are growing like crazy, and this kind of talk sounds silly. Yeah, you're not even seeing any footprints like this. It's coming. It may be coming asymmetrically, but it is coming one way or another. Other questions about this? So in the negotiated side, almost I don't have a choice. Every time my group has ever, like senior leadership outside of me, has ever had a conversation about could we do this differently, they always say, well, this staffing group says they can come in and do it without, and we'll talk about the other buckets, without any extra support. And I'll say, yeah, they'll just charge you 3 times as much for the widget. Give me 2 times as much and I don't need anything from you at all. I mean, it's really, there's no magical way to make this work. It's just they negotiate, they balance bill, they do all those things that you and I are not really comfortable with and aren't really long-term success strategies anyway. You're going to ask me something.
Yeah, so with these integrated delivery systems, the system saves money when you do less.
Correct.
The system is your worst payer.
Correct.
How does that win on?
I was wondering if you would say, where's the win? Eventually, there has to be winnowing down. There has to be some winnowing down. And there have to be difficult decisions. The key thing is, do we have the right number of people doing the right job and being compensated fairly? My goal isn't to make sure that 3 years from now I have the same or more providers. It's that I have the right number of providers, each of whom are prepared. You're going to see on the last slide what I think what leadership's all about when you get to that point. But you're right. An integrated system does not insulate you from some of the real realities that are coming economically. It gives you more control, and perhaps you can mitigate some of them, but you're not making them go away. Same thing's true of emergency medicine. We're not like back surgeons where if I did elective back surgery, I'd be scared to death. You know, nobody needs their 3rd back surgery. Nobody. And no one needs their 4th. And so that's real. You can't make widgets anymore when we figure that all out. I think there'll always be unscheduled needs. So but we won't be immune to some of the other discretionary choices. Yeah.
Why is bigger always better, though?
It isn't. So we're getting to bigger is not better. Bigger is one strategy that comes with its attendance risk. But you're exactly right. Bigger is not better about it. Where else do departments get money? So the number 2 bucket behind that would be, and I'm always torn about what the right word is, hospital support. Administrators usually have a more demeaning, pejorative way of explaining this to you. We give it to you because you can't eat what you kill and because you can't make your budget and blah, blah, blah. My view on this is that we entered into a partnership together that usually you negotiated the entire forest for both of us. And I'm perfectly fine with that. But that means that we may have to do some sharing along the way. And that to have a hospital means you have to have an emergency department, and that brings attendant fixed expenses in. And to have a top-rate training center or research brings in attendant expenses. And let's talk about the way. We all got buckets of money to help have that all happen. It's not, you're not doing a favor for me. We're deploying the resource in the way that it was intended. Does anybody here get all of their GME money that every resident got? I could run a great department if I got the entire federal attribution for each resident. I need very little after that. I mean, I get a fraction of it. It's kept centrally for other things. I get that. I get why it is. So if you've seen one approach, you've actually seen one approach. There's all different types of approach. In most departments, whether they're academic or not, this is the second biggest stream of money behind either direct or indirect payments for clinical care. This is usually a minimum of 20% and often can be 40%. Again, if you're in a more dire situation, the hospital support may end up being higher than this because you're likely having billing challenges, not being able to generate it yourself. The basic fact, as we talked about, is the hospital bills and collects for at least 3 to 4 times what you can, period. That's the system that was made. You and I don't do any of those really big ticket widget procedures that generate oodles of cash. Yes, it is unfair that you can snatch somebody from the jaws of death with a countershock and assisted ventilation, and the ophthalmologist doing a 15-minute cataract gets paid more. I am sorry that those are the realities that were negotiated somewhere back in the 70s with the AMA and how they decided relative values. It's not fair, but this is the world we live in. I don't see any immediate fixes coming anytime soon. So the problem is that to have an academic department or even a clinical service, there are fixed things that have to be done that you can't. I can't go, when volume goes down to a patient every hour or two or even less than that, I can't have less than one provider. I can't have 0.4 of a provider. And I have to staff not to the highest of peaks, but I can't just go to the middle, because that means I'll deliver lousy service at a certain point in time and expose us to all the kinds of risks that eventually you pay for one way or another. The other thing is that everybody in this room is very, very good at what we talked about before, negotiating, leading, getting the resolution. And you will, one by one, be pulled out for other jobs. And everybody will always want you to do that. Can't you be the director of risk or safety? Can't you be so-and-so? And it's easy that you want to volunteer, you want to say yes, but not draw back the support. Those are real jobs. Those require something. So in my view, this is the payment for providing all of that service. It's not support because you just happen to be nice people or I run my business really lousy. Yeah.
Just one of the things just talking about models wise, which is another one, with all the stuff you're saying with support, is the environment I'm in, they have its HCA. So they're actually the biggest purveyor of gym in the country, if not now starting July 1st, of anybody.
UPMC is third. UPMC is third.
But it's going to be huge.
Right, right.
But the thing is, their department structure is such that they have a hospital and they subcontract to staffing groups. You don't get anything except what you sew. But even the resident money goes to the hospital. It's kind of a weird model.
It is a funny model. And each model is, yeah. Well, we'll talk about the specific types of models. The first one is a very algorithmic model, which each year, or more commonly each 3 years, sometimes it can even be longer, there are very specific calculations of the volume of people you're serving, the kind of work you're doing, maybe some quality of process in you, and you formulaically say this is the participation that the system or the hospital gives your institution. It's actually fairly rare for a pure algorithmic model for support. It's probably the one that, it's what I would prefer. I don't have that right now, but it's what I'd prefer. It makes it very, very clear. It ties the support to contemporaneous actions. When you blend it over a couple of years, it means you don't have to take a haircut 1 year if there's a blip in some condition that calculates it. It's kind of smoothed over. It allows you to adapt to things. It means if your workload or your participation to the hospital's mission or bottom line goes up, you get more. It's not just based, you're not stuck with yesterday's deal. So pure algorithmic is one approach to funding that hospital system. The historical is probably the more common. You get what you got before, or maybe what you got before plus or minus some made-up factor. Okay? This is why your friends in medicine, orthopedics, and neurosurgery get paid more. Is that at some moment in time they had leverage. They generated the really expensive widget producing events, and they got a deal. That's why they do really well. The a la carte is where you go along line by line and say, well, I do this much for that, this much for this much for that. I'll give you X for the department and then each individual job. The more common method that I see is a hybrid, and it's something between historical and the a la carte method, where you're tied to a baseline number, whether it was ever calculated on anything. Even if it was true 10 years ago, it may not have anything to do with today's set of conditions. And then there are some a la carte for activities and duties being done before. So the model isn't particularly good. The model I live with right now is that hybrid one right now. I'm trying to work through. It's hard as one department, even having a more senior role in it, to say we need to look at funds flow differently. Why do you think it's hard? You think these cats have any interest in looking at how the funds flow go? So all of a sudden, you're pitting physician groups against each other, and let me promise you there's no win in that for anybody. So trying to get people to say, do we really need this? How many CT surgeons do we really have to serve this population? If you build them, they will come. In other words, they will If you hire a CT surgeon, he'll take out someone's esophagus. Whether it needs to be done or not is a whole separate question. So those are the essential models of it. So right now, we've talked about 90 to 95% of the funding for most departments, and clearly ones that are not engaged in academic activities. That's it right there. And it's important to stop at that because, as I said before, if you're running a department, you want to run one, do not ever lose sight of the fact that the clinical mission, you will get 3 or 4 or 5 years to fix the scholarly side. Investigation, teaching, get a lot of time to do that. People want you to succeed. You will not get 3 years to fail on the delivery side, no matter what your credentials are. You won't get it because this is how we live. And the world's changing around us to more commoditized. And even stalwarts of academic medicine are going to learn this lesson, and they're going to learn it the hard way. I think you're getting ready to ask something.
It can even be a few months because the reason I brought up the staffing comments is that my medical director with me on the academic chair, they had a change in their volume because RV driven, it's what we sell in the sense of that. And they had a change in 3 months, and they made them cut the staffing.
You either have to cut the staffing or cut the reward per staffing.
But it's not here. They
Yeah.
do it really tiny.
Yeah. And this is it's a more business-like approach. We're used to being shielded from all this, and what I have to tell you, even on the academic side, that's not going to happen anymore. We're going to have to be more responsive to things. Where else can you get money from? We actually get a chunk from the educational side, and there's really 2 places where you get educational money. One is on the GME side. Your hospital, for many, sometimes even all, of their slots, got a bucket of money to train people through the federal government. Okay. Not every slot is. UPMC right now is the 3rd largest GME trainer in the country, just given its size, about 1,800 residents and fellows. I think a third of those are unfunded. Those are slots that existed after the 96 cap and without any kind of deftness that you can pick up a few spots here and there. So that means a third are essentially a different form of hospital support, which is the previous slide that we talked about. Again, only part of that money passes through. Obviously, the salary for the resident usually passes through that. That's not coming out of your clinical revenues. Their benefits usually come out of that. And then a tiny amount to help support the teaching, but no one generally that I'm aware of. I have not met a place yet where there was really significant chunks of that dedicated money coming for all the other teaching that you do as faculty. It's usually for a few administrative spots and a few other things. They're not giving you your educational incentive from that. They're using that to take care of the back office and to make sure. The argument would be we have overhead to have residents on, yada, 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 yada. I'm not here to debate whether that's right or wrong. It's the realities of every system I've ever interfaced with. Number 2 is from the medical school side, which is probably even more dire. So we teach students who pay $50,000 to $75,000 a year to learn about medicine often, and a little tiny bit of that trickles back to you, but a tiny bit. At the University of Pittsburgh, we have a thing called an educational credit unit. So if you teach an hour with a student, that would be 1 ECU. If you ran a course, if it was a little course, it might be credited with 20 units. If you ran a really big course, it might be 200 units, and it's a value system. The problem is these ECUs were created as a way to make an algorithmic way to feed things back, but they're like rubles in that they keep getting issued, and the total amount of money behind it isn't really any different. So they become devalued over time. So they used to be about $100 per unit. Now they're down to 60, 65. And for me, the challenge is that people who are doing the teaching didn't do anything different year after year, and it went down. And so I have to find some way to backfill that so that the individual who feels like they're still being the same excellent teacher they always were gets the same reward. But you realize in that model, I eventually keep paying more and more out of another part of the bucket for something that's underfunded. And this is another. So you can get money from schools. I've just never heard of any system. If you can break even on your teaching, you've done exceptionally well. And this is one of the areas that I have to really watch to make sure, not that it's a tiny part of the bucket, but to make sure, we'll talk later on the expense side, that it doesn't consume. I mean, I don't even hope to break even, but I try to mitigate the losses with it. It's an important part of our mission. Some money comes through, but it's usually not a breakthrough. At most places, this is rarely over 15%. In my own institution, I think it's about 12% of our total take comes in between either GME funding or School of Medicine funding. That's actually a fairly big number. There are departments, we're the second or third highest in the School of Medicine, even though we're not, size-wise, we would be in the below the middle of the pack size-wise, because we have a lot of people teaching, doing a lot of stuff that way. So you have to work really hard to just make it an okay feedback, and in a relative sense, I'm not sure it's all that much. So that is one bucket. If you're in a more traditional clinical setting, this just doesn't exist, period. So my partners who run a private practice, they stopped after the first 2 slides. They can take off here. The next bucket is gifts. And we hear about this all the time. I just had somebody who spent time with Jim Adams at Northwestern. Everybody knows Jim here? So Jim was a resident with us, and this guy came back to me, our institutional gifts officer, and said, I just met this guy who's the greatest. You'll never know about it. He's fabulous. He's figured out the whole gifts thing. And I said, yeah, he was here and left, and we know the deal. Gifts are very, very hard. I know very few people who have had more than just modest success getting gifts, whether the gifts come from patients and family members, influentials in the community. You often try to start with your own trainees, your own ex-faculty. If any one of you talk to an endowment person, they'll say, it all starts at home, get your own people contributing first, then I can go out and solicit money. It's just very, very hard to do. I'll tell you a story, and Ben knows this story well. The challenge that we have in emergency medicine is the people who you would think should be the most grateful to you don't even know that you and I existed. So I'll tell you a story. Very prominent publisher drops dead in Pittsburgh at actually the U.S. Steel building. And at that point, it was the first place in the city that had an automatic defibrillator there on site. This is how long ago it was. It's almost 20 years ago. So he keels over at a board meeting, gets countershocked in the field. One of our trainees meets him there, assists his ventilations. I see him in the emergency department. He's kind of out of it. I talked to the cardiologist on call that day. He goes up, he gets a vessel opened and an implantable defibrillator put in. The attending cardiologist who's going to cover the service long time, he was a doctor's doctor. You know what that phrase means? It means you know everybody who to consult is generally what that really. He came in almost 2 days later. He never saw them. I spoke to it. That gentleman later on did a newspaper article about how grateful he was for the cardiologist's care and endowed him. And I just didn't exist. That was in that period of I was dead and right back to life and blah, blah. You and I are often, and I don't mean to be negative about it, but we're competing with other people who participate in this impactful care. And there's just not usually either deep enough pockets or enough sympathy for the front side. Like, you can't have a catheterization if I let you die. That kind of logic is kind of hard to impress upon people. I guess you could, but... and so it's really, really hard. And then on top of it, your organization may not want you to be going one-on-one with patients. I think our stories would be very compelling. But again, getting back to the changing the funds flow model, that means someone has to decide you're the priority, not whoever did the next procedure or whoever was there when they woke up and what they remember about things. And so it's hard. It's very, very hard. I don't know of very many places. This is usually way less than 10%. Oftentimes, it's so way less than 10%, it's almost a blip. In my own institution, it's a few endowments that we have in place, and that's that. There's not really, I think we have a $10,000 fund. That's not even worth, in a department budget that's multiple millions, it's a drop in the bucket. There are some folks who actually do better at this. My advice to you would be, I think you should hope for this, but recognize that it is a tough slog. And I don't know that this will fix your financial future. I think you should always aspire for it, hope for it, try to get maybe start with your grads and your ex-faculty members, but I don't think it's going to be the solution. Just don't see it right now. And then research. We run a really big research institution, not only Pitt as its own institution, but my department does really well, even with high-powered people. I have 3 active grants right now. I don't cover anywhere near my salary. Everybody who tells you I'm fully funded on a grant, what that means is I'm fully funded for just the academic part of my salary, which is 1/4 of everything that I make. Nobody really is fully funded. It's or very few people, particularly in emergency medicine, are. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't generally pay the whole bills. It's still important. It's what allows people to have an investigative career. It offsets, but you're not going to get rich on this side of the research equation. You're not going to. If you can mitigate the costs for creating new knowledge, for creating the new ways for everybody, you've done very, very well. In a big department, it's very rare that it would be above 20% of your budget, probably more in the 10 to 15% range. That's where we sit, right in that ballpark. There's essentially two big buckets. There's the federal bucket, NIH kind of stuff. That comes with a chunk called indirect, which is for all your background costs, and then direct for what it really costs to do, or what they thought it cost to do the trial. So you get two big hunks. The indirect, in general, is at least 50% of whatever the rest of it was. At some places, it can be almost 100%. In other words, you get doubling of your money for, quote, the background costs of things. The problem is most of us don't have control over all or any of the indirects because it's taken by the institution. If you do get control, usually they charge you for every little thing such that eventually this just becomes a money laundering scheme, and back to it. Foundations, industry, or other type of local grants is usually where most of us are getting much of our support, particularly for early investigators or people bridging in their career. And those are almost specifically designed with one of two mechanisms in mind. To get you started, to make sure costs are covered or barely covered, or to make sure that whoever is funding it, and this is particularly true on industry research, they're in business most of the time. And they need a very specific short-term performance or they're pulling the cord. You know, NIH, the real thing is if you get a grant, it's yours until the end. You may not get ever renewed again if you don't fulfill the grant, but you'll get everything in the original grant. Industry, that's not true. If you begin to fail on performance, that money's coming right out. It could happen in the middle of a fiscal year. The plug is pulled. It's business. And so that's kind of how these two separate. So there's some attributes of the federal bucket that look more appealing. In general, though, the total federal money, particularly if you're not having control of the indirects, ends up not being as much. You're doing it for other reasons. You're doing it to support that cost, but not necessarily to fund other parts of the department. It's very, very rare to have somebody who has such a big place, a big capture of monies that they can actually help support other things. That's generally someone who gets a coordinating center kind of grant for a very large trial. That brings in a whole lot of extra resources, but those are few and far between. So your new institution has a great deal with that because it's been the coordinating center for now 2 consecutive big trials. But most places don't have that. So research is a great place to go, but again, even at your steeped in tradition, it would be very, very rare. I can tell you even at Pitt, the Department of Psychiatry is the highest ranked in federally funding department in the country, and they bridge about 20% of the total operating budget, and that's with way more R01s and active grants than any other place in the country, and that's, you know, to the max. It's just hard to do really well. Yeah.
This is the department level perspective on research.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what your sense is of the institutional level research perspective on research. Like, does UPMC value the fact that you guys are doing a lot of research? And also, what's like the 10 and 20 year, trajectory on how that?
Oh boy. So you're asking what's the broader view on research? So there's 2 entities. There's the university and then UPMC. So almost all federal related activity is a university issue. The dollars flow through the university. UPMC is happy about that, but really happy and disinterested at the same moment in time. So industry work has tendency to be more on the health system side. The UPMC view is, and this is going to be harsh, is that NIH is a backwards-looking institution where people reward derivative work that looks like theirs. And it's why you don't see a lot of innovation out of NIH type of work. You see it more out of Hughes Foundation, other kind of stuff. They take higher risk, higher reward. So that the NIH model rewards longevity. The average age of investigators is going up. That would suggest that it's an inside club. You know, there's lots of activity to kind of try to change that now, but that's really the reality now. And that maybe that's backward looking, and that if you really want to succeed moving forward, you should be embracing new models. UPMC's decided to invest itself $200 million in research, but it has to be things that would never be considered NIH, that are so novel that you wouldn't actually have 5 pages of background information. Because in fact, if you had that, you were probably doing something more derivative than truly novel. That's the thinking behind that. Pitt, on the other hand, this is how Pitt gets to keep those indirects. They think this is a fabulous deal, and we should do more and more of it. And now that we're at 5, we should get to 4. And it's just a game of more. It's a different type of widget game. Not that it's not important. Ben, I think you were going to ask me something. How do I mitigate the NIH salary cap versus the salary of an investigator? I actually don't try to mitigate it. I say that this bought X% of that time. I don't subsidize. They either add on clinical work for that or take on an administrative job with it, or they don't. So this commonly comes up. The example this comes up the most on is K Awards. So a K Award gives trainees $75,000 and says that has to be 75% of their academic time. And you and I both know no one's hiring someone who's 3 years out of residency and maybe a year out of a fellowship on $75,000 or even $100,000 is not coming. And so we give them a clinical opportunity also separate from that, but they do not get paid the same as a 4-year clinician who is working 1,600 clinical hours a year. I don't try to do that. They're making an investment in their own career. We set them up for success to get the next wave of funding. But I think when you change the game that you will be paid the same as a busy clinician early on, you've actually ensured that people like that are not likely to succeed further along, because you've shown an alternative path around the markers that's not sustainable. It just isn't sustainable that way. You're investing in yourself in that period of time. So I actually don't try to do it. I say this is the time that you got off, and it's formulaic. You can have it all. I won't take a taste. But what you're really doing with the other model is you're asking your partners to subsidize someone in the beginning part of the career. We do that for very short periods of time at the takeoff, a year or 2, but we don't do it indefinitely. I just don't do that. I think once you start that, you're on a slope that the numbers, you are taking money from one group and giving it to another. Yeah.
What about using the avenue of core faculty type? There's funding potential for that, and adding a small bit on top for research. But they don't have grants yet.
So the question is, why not use core faculty and do a little bit of research? My own view on this is that you have to have a narrow group of people who are fully focused and immersed in research if they're going to either have impact and success at the old derivative way, if you think NIH is that way, or really do the novel stuff. Having a lot of people who dabble in research means that you'll have lots of little projects, none of which end up going very well. We made a shift maybe 18 years ago in that direction. So the amount of faculty who do research now, really engage in it, is much narrower, but the productivity is much higher. I think you concentrate it in there. Just like, everybody may teach a little bit during a shift, but the amount of people who are dedicated to having extended teaching time are the people with the passion and skills to do it. I think that everybody doing a little bit of everything is inefficient and it's expensive, and we're going to have to make some difficult choices here. It's why people think academic medical centers won't survive, because we have lots of this around here, everybody doing a little bit of this. It's hard to get rich on this kind of approach, but it is one of the other ways that we fill the bucket. So the final thing I want to talk about is one way to get new money, and this is the exciting part, and I can't tell you it's because we've mastered it, is you can create some new novel device product. You can be the person who actually eliminates the need for your job, or at least as many of you. That's the real way. We had a radiologist at UPMC. It's so long ago you'll think the story's old. He was the first one to create the digital platform for looking at plain films. So who uses Philips EyeSight here? And it was called, Stentor was the other name of it before. That was a radiologist who had a computer background in 1989, blah, blah. And he realized that, back then when I worked, the biggest thing I had to deal with was people complaining about who stole the chest x-ray. Upstairs, they were convinced you and I had this thing going on that we would take an x-ray and then throw it away someplace so that they would have to take it again later on. And he said, if I can make this work, and he actually did the initial work just in the ED, with the idea being that if it could work in the ED, it would work in the rest of the hospital. And the day he invented it, my job was easier. And it also meant I didn't have to have a radiologist on call nearby. You could have them centrally. I mean, we don't even think about the whole tele thing now, but that didn't exist when I was first out. That was a transformative event, and it changed their work practice. It changed mine. In our world, we do some of the tele platforms. That's really, can I can I answer your acute care issue without you physically coming in? I mean, is my training really specific to the drywall of the emergency department, or is it being able to assess people with acute illness and injury and deciding what needs to happen next, including maybe you need to see someone else or you don't need to see someone else? Those kind of things. Maybe it'll be a device, maybe it'll be a test, maybe it'll be a treatment, I don't know. But those are your options. The trouble here is they're hard to depend on. This is the kind of thing, if you can monetize, would free you from the shackles of the first 4 slides, which is clinical revenue and then everything else being little bits in a slog. But it's really hard. Everybody wants these. Rich Zane out of Colorado has an entire division built on innovation. I don't know that they have a hit yet. But this is the future. This is the way an academic medical center, we're here talking about departments, this is the way they'll survive. They'll either get leaner and meaner, or they will create things that everybody else can't copy. That's why does Apple command a premium? Because they created things either that people couldn't copy or people thought they couldn't live without. Why does Amazon exist? You know, Nordstrom isn't really battling with Macy's anymore. They're battling with Amazon because Amazon gets you what you want in a different way, in a completely different way we never even thought about. Yeah.
So I've developed some things, and the problem I've had with that is that all the money ends up going to the university.
Well, it depends on how you structure things up. You're right. But this is one where you would begin, if you did it on the time, you would begin a carve-out saying, you know, it's a shared thing. I can't develop it without you. At our place, we have a clear set of contractual guidelines about how much comes through. You're right. That is an important part. We're not good at the business side of this. And so is the university or the health system going to be your partner, or is it going to be somebody else from the outside? I don't know, but this is the opportunity. You know what? We did so much here that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get much more done. Can I get, rather than talk about where money goes, I think people get this. We've talked about this. Can I? We're near the end. There's something I wanted to give you a few thoughts at the end. It kind of ties into everything else. The money goes out, 80% of the money goes out on people. And the rest is in equipment, other things. So when you're cutting costs, you're usually talking about a few nickels on non-people things that you really pay a lot of attention to, coding, billing, equipment, blah, 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 blah. But that's only 15% of it, and everything else is people. And there's only so many support people you can get rid of before the job's unbearable. You're not really saving anything anymore. So you have to find ways to be more efficient. It's nice if you can build a reserve inside your department to smooth over a couple of years. Usually, most of us can't do that. It's a very hard thing to do. I can't do that. I have a magical fund balance that there's no access to because it's swept into the central corporate area. So I can't smooth. I live on operations year to year. Even people I know who have it don't have multi-year rainy weather funds. So it just doesn't happen because most of us are not independent groups by ourselves. We're in with another practice. You'll live and die on operations, so make sure you take care of that while you're doing excellent teaching, training, investigative stuff. Transparency is best. I'm talking about not only when you're talking up and negotiating with people for, I want my funds flow to be different, but with your partners. I've taken a couple lumps this week because we shared, we had downward volume trends at like same-store sales, if you were looking at it that way. And sharing with my partners, this is what it looks like for the current fiscal year that's going to close out. Nobody said thanks for telling me this shitty news. Nobody said that. But I do believe in the long haul, it's that keeping people informed is the best strategy to go. I don't think anybody's going to go. Conversations with your faculty, and more importantly, and Ben, I think I told you this when you were talking, with senior leadership, these are a trust exercise. And it's not about, I heard the previous one, it's not about what can you get, particularly when you're trying to negotiate for your department. What can I squeeze out of everyone else? This is a kind of a partnership, and this is people are learning. You present what's the predicament, what are the range of solutions, and what you need. If you're coming in as a brand new chair, I promise you, no matter what you ask for, you will overlook at least one thing. If you scalp people on the way in, that will be the tone of the rest of your relationship. Don't do it. Get what you need to succeed, but don't take more than that. And show that you're a willing partner. You understand that we're in this together and that change is coming. It's here right in front of us. They want to hear that you understand the current and what's coming down the road, not just the past and right now. And my favorite phrase is that in times of plenty, leadership is a matter of taste. It's like picking out a good wine or a great dessert. But you and I are about to enter times of leanness. And this is where leadership gets really hard, because you're going to have to choose amongst 3 or 4 goods, and you can only afford 1 or 2 of them. And by goods, I mean good things, not just physical products. And the financial part or the business part will have to make priority decisions. You're not going to be able to do all the things that you did in the past or all the things that could be very, very good. So it's a different job. When there's plenty of stuff going on, it's actually enjoyable. It's like picking a meal. This is a little bit different. Recognize that if you do it well, you actually guide your department to the promised land and they survive. There will be, after this initial transition period, I don't care where you're at, there'll be a settling down, there'll be a thinning of the herd, and I think a restoration of something that actually resumes looking much like what we had before, although delivered in a different way. But you got to get there first, and you got to do that by being willing to be transparent and make some of those difficult decisions. Anything else I can answer for folks? We got into a lot of stuff here. Yeah.
With those reserve funds, have you ever seen one that's set up where the hospital couldn't come in and raid it?
No, I've never seen one I've never seen one where you had essentially an untouchable. So, I mean, I hate to be, I'm sure it might exist somewhere like a unicorn, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
You mentioned how honesty and transparency are inherently good.
And painful. Did I say that part?
Yes.
Okay.
You mentioned that. Are there any scenarios in which you think it's actually better to conceal information from people?
No. I think sometimes the mistake is giving too much information because it can't be processed, and then you're in a never-ending cycle of trying to explain line by line. So I'd never go through the entire balance sheet with the faculty. But I would say in general, here's where we're at, and here's what we're collected, here's what's coming out. I think it's a matter of detail, because not everybody comes to that conversation with a similar level of expertise or understanding. At the end of the day, most people will find a line and say, this looks like I should be paid more. And that's all the conversation is. I'm telling, this is the, Brian, did I misstate this? Everybody who you're going to talk to was the brightest boy or girl in their class. And they're very good at identifying what our perceived variances are and why it should translate into a bigger reward. Jamie, do I have that right? Yes. So I think I keep it high level, but always truthful. And if they ask a very specific question, I give it. I think when you lose the trust game, it's over after that. It's just really, it's the beginning of the end. It may take a long time, but it's the beginning of the end. Yeah.
When the system asks you to double up more EPs, does it benefit your department to have more EPs that you're overseeing?
The question is, when I have to take on other essentially purely clinical shops, does it benefit the department? Yes and no. I don't have the opportunity to take pure profit from Timbuktu and move it in to a gap that exists in that current fiscal year. What it does, though, indirectly is makes us, and us as emergency medicine, more and more invaluable to the system, such that the conversations that we talked about are more likely to result in a positive action. So it's a more indirect way. It'd be unfair to say just because I can't shift $1 from Susquehanna into Pittsburgh that it's not. It does. It makes us invaluable. Almost nothing happens now without somebody from our department involved because of all those interactions. Yeah.
You alluded to several times that you feel like academic medical centers are up for hard times ahead.
Yes.
And one of the drivers you said is kind of the departments themselves not getting as much reimbursement from the academic medical centers for teaching time. What do you see as like other large drivers of those hard times ahead?
So people want things cheaper, quicker, and unless they're, again, married to or delivering health care, they don't want to pay as much for it. And the worst group of people to respond to consumerism demands is academic medical centers. We have for 100 years told ourselves all the wonderful stuff we do and why we deserve to be paid more. I was elected rep from Pitt to the AAMC. Anybody here go to AAMC? I know Julie does. So I went to the Council of Faculty in Academic Sciences 4 years ago, and I listened for an hour and a half. People talk about if we just said it louder and better, the government will give us more money and we won't have to have. And I got up and finally said, are you people, do you not have friends that are outside of medicine? I mean, do you hear what you're saying? This is not the direction things are going. Every other piece you pick up says healthcare costs are out of control, I'm spending too much on X, Y, and Z. That's what we do, right? We inherently don't respond well to that, and we've had 100 years of training not having to respond to it. So I think it's going to be hard. I think it's going to be really hard. It's like anybody who had a monopoly. Once competition comes in, it's hard to catch back up. There'll be some thinning of the herd, but some sites will do really well. They'll figure it out and they'll do well. All right, I've went over. It's been a great time. I appreciate it. I'll be hanging out if anybody wants to chat.